Greetings and welcome to the Convocation Unscripted, where religion, culture, and politics intersect in real time. I'm one of your hosts for this episode, Jemar Tisby, joined as always, thankfully, by Diana Butler Bass
It's great to see you on screen, friends.
and Kristin Du Mez.
Hi, Jemar.
And of course, in absentia is Robbie Jones. We'll talk more about him and what's coming up next for us in a moment. So we're we're four scholars, three historians and a sociologist, we'll count Robbie, who explore how religion shapes America's past and present. But of course, there's a twist. One of us, well, we all pick topics and we don't know exactly what's coming or what each other's going to say. It's just raw, unfiltered conversation. So that's why we call it the Convocation Unscripted. Last time, if you've been tuning into our episodes, we mentioned that we had a retreat coming up. Well, as we record this, that retreat is now past. And so we are excited to give you some updates on what we discussed, what's coming next for the Convocation Unscripted. But we didn't want to do that without Robbie here. So we will wait until our next recording when Robbie is with us and we'll give you the full rundown. But we can give you a highlight of an adventure that we took. We went on a Ferris wheel. Right? That's the one. I always get Ferris wheel and carousel confused, but it's the one that's vertical.
The one that's high in the sky.
Why was this such a big adventure?
Because Kristin and Diana are afraid of heights.
Yeah,
Well, we
there
were
was a little
very
peer
brave.
pressure. You were very brave and you challenged yourselves and you set a great example for people. And we've got pictures for proof. So look in our next Substack where we post this recording for some pictures from the infamous adventurous carousel or Ferris wheel ride.
Ferris wheel. Be as courageous as you can, right, Diana? That's our motto. We did it.
We did. We were brave.
Well, it's appropriate that we had a little bit of mirth, a little bit of in-person community time, because I feel like as soon as we got back, it was just to quote Diana, a potpourri of shit show. I think that's what we came down to. So here's what we are tackling in this very breathless episode of the Convocation Unscripted. The South African president Ramaphosa visited the White House, and that went as you would expect, as you would predict. The SCOTUS rules on funding, federal or public funding for Oklahoma religious schools. Hegseth's prayer meeting, a shooting in D.C., and Jews and Gaza, and an attack on Harvard. And that's just within a couple of days, y'all. So we wanted to give you a rundown of what we're going to be discussing. And let's kick things off with South African President Ramaphosa's visit to the White House. Now, of course, Elon Musk is from South Africa, so it's been in the news a bit more lately. But the president visiting the White House amid increased sanctions, amid these racial overtones, and amid granting refugee status to white South African farmers and fast tracking them to get approval in the US was all the backdrop for this visit to the White House, which was punctuated by President Trump showing this lengthy video claiming to justify or prove genocide, that's the word they used, against white South Africans. Diana, you saw an article by our friend Lisa Sharon Harper who made a really apt and chilling parallel. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I was really taken by what she said. And there's so many layers of that South Africa story, obviously. But she pointed out how when Woodrow Wilson was president, there was the premiere, the showing of Birth of a Nation um, at, at the White House, which was, of course, the fiction account, sort of a propaganda film of what we might want to call the lost cause religion that had emerged after the American Civil War, and it was that film that becomes sort of the rallying cry for all of the violence that unfolded, especially in the 1920s against African Americans and the increase in the Klan membership and lynching, etc., in that decade immediately following the showing of that film. And so Lisa Sharon paralleled the film that Trump showed to the South African president. He said, "Oh, you don't believe there's a genocide? Well, let me show you this film." And they watched a fairly long, I mean, not an hour film or a 2 hour film the way Birth of a Nation was, but a fairly long sort of YouTube film on how Black people were, in the same way as in A Birth of a Nation, running sort of rampant across South Africa, murdering white people. And that was functionally the theme of the film that had shown more than 100 years ago at the White House. And I just thought it was so stunning that Lisa thought of that parallel. And so, you know, showcasing that kind of conspiracy propaganda in the White House, that's a really powerful platform that can have huge consequences. Um, the ones in the past were terrible. So anyway, that was one of the things I thought we should really point out in conjunction with this. Plus, it's the only just uh, Holly Berkeley Fletcher has been on a lot of shows, the Bulwark and Ben Wittish show, both podcasts, in the last 2 days because she's was a CIA expert in Africa.
Mm.
And she has relatives actually that currently live in South Africa. And she pointed out on one of those shows, I think it was Ben Witt's show this morning, that there have only been 59 refugees admitted to the United States since Donald Trump has been president. Everybody else was canceled or put on hold. And it was only these 59 white South Africans who have actually been admitted under refugee status since Donald Trump was inaugurated in January. Everybody else can't come.
This
15,
is
59 white people.
we saw this with uh, 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 Zelensky's visit. Just utterly, even you want to make it Christian. Let's talk about the virtue of hospitality, right? Just completely runs roughshod over, even for people you disagree with. There's a way to host them that can show hospitality, right? And then to bring in Ramaphosa, who is a protege of Nelson Mandela, helped broker the agreement that ended apartheid in South Africa in 1994. And people were praising his calm. Well, he's had to deal with folks like Trump and Elon Musk before. Nevertheless, to grant refugee status to people who aren't being persecuted, what they're calling persecution are attempts at equity and repair for apartheid. And people like Elon Musk are calling it racist because he can't come in with his Starlink satellites and doesn't follow the laws of South Africa to grant equity to Black business owners. And then he says that's racist or reverse racism. And this is, again, the weaponization of movements for civil rights, movements for equality, and now claiming aggrievement of white people. And then to add insult to injury on top of the absolute um, ridiculous rudeness, beyond rudeness that it goes, he's completely shaking up the international relations for this country. But then to show this video as propaganda from the White House, knowing it will be covered, knowing it will be televised, knowing it will be talked about, is only proof positive that what this regime is not about immigration writ large. It's not about protecting borders in any reasonable sense of the word. It's about empowering a certain kind of white people person. And this is a display of it. So it was absolutely horrifying. Whatever the White House is spewing about relations with South Africa, absolutely understand that they have an agenda that is anti-equality, anti-Black, I would say, and spurious, to put it mildly.
Now, Kristen, you're up, I think, with a couple of stories about
I will
Christian
cover the Christian
nationalism.
nationalist beat.
Yeah, we're
Yeah,
just gonna go keep
that's
going.
my turf. So let's see where to start. We have a surprise decision, a Supreme Court decision. So here's a little bit of good news. In terms of the decision handed down with respect to that religious charter school in Oklahoma. And whether government funding, taxpayer funding could fund that, or if that was a violation of the First Amendment, right? And so it's a Catholic charter school. This is a kind of test case. And what surprised many observers today was that conservative Justice Amy Coney Barrett, she didn't side against the school, but she recused herself.
Hmm.
She recused herself because, well, she doesn't say specifically why, but it's assumed because she has ties to the legal team arguing on behalf of the school. Um, but I just want to pause here because this is remarkably heartening for me, not because the decision went one way or another, and it was a draw, and so it could be brought up again in a different way. So we may not, this may not be the end of the story, but refreshing to me because it is an example, and a rare example these days, of conservative, in this case justice, we could say politician or whatever, who decides to follow the rules
Yeah.
instead of pushing through an agenda. Somebody whose heart is perhaps, with certainly with Catholic education, and perhaps even around this issue, but is holding to principles of, her responsibility as a judge with ties in this, and arguably principles of the separation of church and state, or quite possibly, right? And so I think this is a very important case. It's one that many of us were watching. And yet another instance where Amy Coney Barrett is a disappointment to those in the MAGA movement. And so I think just important to pause and recognize that today, and take a little win when we have one.
And it's a virtual charter school, right? Like this.
Right. Thank you. It's a virtual charter school. It's a virtual Catholic charter school, right? Wanting taxpayer funding. Yes.
And I have both Kristen and I have Catholic education backgrounds, and mine even before Notre Dame, kindergarten through 8th grade. I went to Catholic schools, and we had to have fundraisers. I swear it was every other month to try to raise money for the school on top of paying tuition, right? So it's not it's an instance where I get it. I understand wanting more funding or more help that way, but more importantly, I do think there needs to be that separation of church and state. And especially from this regime, they're going to privilege a certain kind of church or a certain kind of religion. And so it wouldn't apply equally to Muslims or Hindus or Jewish people or people of other religions, other than this very narrow conception, extremely right wing conception of conservative Christianity. So I think it's important that folks hear from Christians that, like, yeah, this is good, even as someone who identifies as a Christian. I don't want that kind of connection between the government and religious schools.
Yeah.
Yeah, Jamar, you know what you pointed out to me right in those comments is if taxpayers fund Catholic schools, who's going to host bingo nights?
We're going to lose that community connective tissue.
That's right.
Yeah.
Make America great again. Keep bingo in place for fundraising for Catholic schools.
I think it's worth noting too, right, that this was in Oklahoma, even though it
Yeah.
was a virtual school. It was based in Oklahoma, and that's one of the key laboratories, right, in terms of kind of advancing a Christian nationalist agenda within education. I think Oklahoma and Texas, and maybe to a certain extent Tennessee as well. And I remember right after the election seeing some of the Trump supporters and those who are expecting roles inside this administration already, like immediately that night, to start giving kind of marching orders for those at the state level, and particularly in some of these key states, to start working on the ground and guaranteeing them we'll have your back, right? And so again, this is an important kind of pause at the very least in one tiny piece of that agenda.
Hey, but speaking of laboratories and testing grounds, I want to hear you talk about the Tennessee pastor who's the pastor of Pete Hegseth and why he's in the
See,
news this week.
tried to tell folks, but yes, go.
Oh, okay. Well, we have we have the worship service, prayer offered at the Department of Defense, right? Hegseth has just hosted. This was yesterday, was that right? Oh my gosh, I'm trying to catch up with everything, and it's coming very fast. And actually trying to be disciplined and write a book, and then you just take a little peek at social media and like, oh my gosh. So here we have, yes, let me get this straight. It was a prayer meeting that Hegseth organized at the Department of Defense, urging employees to attend, not mandating, but urging and telling them to recruit others to attend. And as far as, I mean, reporters are kind of trying to feel this out. The first on record of something of this sort, from what we can tell, in which they apparently kind of praised Trump as God's anointed leader.
Good Lord.
So once again, separation of church and state, how's that going for us? And what kind of culture does this act cultivate? What kind of space is there for people who would say, yeah, I'd prefer not to attend? What kinds of repercussions may there be for those who decide not to attend? Or what kind of rewards might there be for those who are promoting, recruiting other people to attend, who are showing up and saying amen at the end of this? Right. So again, nothing surprising here. This is exactly what we expected. This is what they promised. And, for those, uh, asking before the election, Christian nationalism, and will we see that in this administration? What's that going to look like? Project 2025. I mean, we've got a lot of examples here, and this is, one of the chief ones, at least of this week.
Yeah, I don't know if you saw all the details of the story, since I didn't realize you were catching up with everything when I asked my question.
No, so tell me about the pastor. I was not aware of his
Well, it
Tennessee
was
pastor. All
those
those,
remarks
yeah.
calling Trump the divinely appointed ruler or whatever it was of the United States were made by Brooks Pottinger, or
Okay.
who's the pastor of
CREC.
Pilgrim Hill. What I don't know what it's called, Reformed Church, something like that, which
Yes.
is Hegseth's church in Tennessee,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
is a noted congregation of the whole Christian nationalist movement. Is that
Yeah.
part of the
Doug Wilson.
Idaho
Yep.
group?
Yeah. Yeah. So
Okay.
it's
Yeah.
I want to get the CREC
Yep.
is the denomination, right, with connections to Doug Wilson. And so that link has been well established. Doug Wilson, for those not in the know, and congratulations for not being in the know, is a kind of a kind of a old standard in terms of right wing proponent of patriarchy and right wing Christianity, but also has in recent years come out promoting Christian nationalism, or at least Canon Press published a prominent book on Christian nationalism. And, he's really been having a moment in the sun, and having Pete Hegseth in that role now only increases his influence. And so what once, and for a long time, really, observers of American Christianity, American evangelicalism like to dismiss, Doug Wilson and his ilk as outliers, as fringe, as like, no, don't pay attention to these guys. Come on, and those of us who were trying to, pay attention to them were accused of, nut picking, of trying to make, good salt of the earth evangelical Christians look bad by holding up these examples. And now here we are, these guys have always had more power than many observers have realized, at least observers who are ensconced in, the Wheaton colleges and the Fuller seminaries and, the Christianity Today boardrooms and so on. They've always had more influence, but certainly now I think their power is undeniable.
It's in the White House. It's in the Department of Defense. I wrote
Right
an
there.
article about this, about Pete Hegseth's brand of Christianity, which didn't even really come up in his confirmation hearings, which was an absolute travesty. And then you trace it back. So I'm glad, Diana, you brought up the connection to his church. According to an article that I looked into while I was researching for my own writing, he and his family specifically moved to that part of Tennessee to go to this church, which is part of the network of churches started by Doug Wilson's small empire in Idaho. Understand, he's not only got a church, he's got a publishing house, Canon Press, which Kristen mentioned. He's got schools, a
Yep.
network of schools set up. So he really is building this right wing. Dominionist Christian nationalist empire is directly influencing Pete Hegseth. Whether or not these two individuals are interacting, he's getting a pipeline of the propaganda through his church, and now is leading prayer services in the Department of Defense that pattern themselves after. And I had my own personal run-ins with Doug Wilson. We saw this coming for more than a decade. Number one, yes, he is influential, and even if he was fringe in his beliefs, he was platformed on mainstream
Yeah.
platforms. I'm talking about Desiring God, the Gospel Coalition, writing for them, showing up at their conferences.
Christianity Today. Yeah.
Christianity Today. So he had a megaphone through these outlets. And this is a guy who wrote the book Black and Tan, which was basically saying an apologist for an apology for an apologist for slavery, basically saying it wasn't as bad as all that, that the stories that you hear are the worst examples, the outliers of slaveholders who weren't Christian or who were really bad Christians, and that it should have just gone away naturally. And there was this huge back and forth with that piece alone, not to mention all of his sexism, homophobia, you name it, all of the worst parts of what you think about as right-wing Christianity. He turns the volume up to 10. And now that direct influence is in the White House. And just because folks haven't heard of it doesn't mean it's not there and doesn't mean it's not powerful. So it really is incredibly disturbing that this strand of religion is in the highest offices of power.
And
And
let
it's
me just
important to oh,
just one quick clarification, because I was saying CREC as the name of the denomination. And I actually had to look it up because I was confused, because it used to be the CRE, the Confederation of Reformed Evangelicals, and now it's the CREC, which is the Communion of Reformed Evangelical Churches. So I just wanted to make sure for our listeners who aren't familiar with that, CREC refers to the Communion of Reformed Evangelical Churches. So, Diana.
I was just going to say I think it's also important to underline that Hegseth and the communications director, I guess, at the Department of Defense actually said that the plan is to hold one of these, they're
Every
called the
month.
Secretary's Prayer Meeting, as a monthly event. And the thing that is so markedly different about this, there have probably been prayer meetings or worship services someplace around the DoD. There's a chapel there, for example. At least that's what I've been told. I've never been in the building, but so what they did is they did not hold it in the chapel. They held it in the auditorium, which apparently seats more people, and it's was on a weekday, not a
Mm.
weekend or any time that was like a sort of a, oh, let's have a Friday afternoon, prayer service because we're worried about our soldiers in Iraq, some focused thing about some very specific aspect of what the Pentagon was doing. But this was a big event for the whole group, the whole, open to everybody in a huge space that will be held monthly. And it was held on a Wednesday morning at 10 a.m. I mean, if you're a college professor, or 10:30 a.m., if you're a college professor, that's the class you want to teach, is the
Mm.
Wednesday morning 10:30 a.m. class, because that's the best hour of the whole week. Uh, so it was like, the
Prime
whole
time.
thing was just sort of held up in a way that has never been sort of framed before by anyone else ever at the Pentagon. And then to invite his pastor from this Tennessee, very radical dominionist church, to be the first speaker, and have it come out of his pastor's mouth that Donald Trump was the sovereignly appointed, or however, I think that was the phrasing they used,
Good Lord.
leader of the nation and must be obeyed. I mean, that is just, it's mind-blowing, and it was upsetting to people at the Department of Defense.
Last quick point on this. This sounds very much like the book, The Gospel of J. Edgar Hoover, how the FBI aided and abetted the rise of white Christian nationalism
Oh,
by
wow.
Lerone A. Martin. And what he details in this book is how J. Edgar Hoover would hold similar events for the FBI. And it would essentially be this unspoken slash open secret that you really couldn't advance in the FBI unless you were a good Christian and attended these events up to and including an actual retreat hosted by the FBI. Now it's Pete Hegseth in the Department of Defense, but giving very much similar vibes to that. So that's The Gospel of J. Edgar Hoover. That's published by Princeton University Press.
Such a good book. Yeah, big fan of Lerone, and that book is really illuminating and in many parts just chilling.
And here we go again. And yet more weighty news. We heard overnight as we record this about a shooting in Washington, D.C., in which two people were killed. Diana, it is so hard to be living in D.C. at this time. What did you hear about this tragedy?
Yeah, well, it started out on the local news that there was a shooting outside of a Jewish museum in the city, which was really weirdly ironic, because on the news earlier this week, there were a couple of different stories about how different Jewish organizations were upping their security, including an interview with the director of this museum. And that was just on the news like 2 days ago. And so they this story comes across, and nobody was really sure what had happened, but by the morning it had become a lot clearer. Is there was an event being held at the museum, which was an event that focused on getting aid to Palestinians in Gaza. So it was an event, I don't know if it was exclusively for Jews or primarily for Jews. I think it was geared towards the Jewish community in Washington, D.C. And it was geared towards, of course, those people who are probably the most humanitarian concerned about what the government of Israel has done, and the horrors of what has happened in Gaza. There are lots of American Jews who are very, very disturbed and upset and hurt by the actions of the government of Israel, feeling like the government of Israel might have actually made, well, have, I mean, I would say have, but the Jewish community is trying to balance these things a little differently, I think, than the Christian community. But there are plenty of good Jews who know that this is not morally acceptable, and that they're trying to do the right things. So this was an event geared towards those people, and it was a young couple, and they were going to this event, and I believe they're both employees of the Israeli embassy, and they were about to become engaged. Actually, the young man had just bought an engagement ring for the young woman, and they were going to Israel next week, and he was planning on proposing to her in Jerusalem. So, this very idealistic, devout, young Jewish couple going to an event to help the Palestinians, and to try to leverage Jewish political power in the United States to open up aid to the people of Gaza.
Hmm.
They were murdered in cold blood outside of this event, and apparently there were a lot of people inside already, and they started hearing that there was this shooting outside. It caused a minor panic among the people who were already in the building. Is somebody going to come in and start shooting everybody? What's going on? Very tragic, horrible thing. And I mean, it's just, I mean, there's so many layers of this that it's almost impossible to talk about. But the two things that immediately came to my mind, of course, is that this is this is not the way to make anything better. And the whole situation. I mean, Gaza has been horrible. The Israeli government has conducted itself immorally since day one. And it is also true that Hamas, as a terrorist organization, did indeed, you know, have a playbook of a terrible terrorist attack in October 2 years ago that started this whole nonsense very specifically. And that terrorist attack was geared, it was psychologically geared, you could tell, to get Jews to just sort of raise up the memories of the Holocaust to be raised up in Jews around the world. And so it was such a blow to the global Jewish community in that terrorist attack, and then this horrible response by Israel. Um, th- it's made this situation so difficult to address, and yet both things are true. Is that everything that has happened in Gaza, in terms of it being a genocide, is absolutely horrendous. And it is also horrendous that there are terrorist groups that have targeted Jews globally on the basis of their religion and ethnicities, and have tried very hard over the course of centuries to eliminate the Jews from the planet. And and so where do we go from here becomes a question. And Jemar, I think you had a couple interesting potential insights about that. Just that you're a little worried. We don't know much about the shooter except that he yelled "Free Palestine" at the. I guess it was at the Reporters today as he was being hauled into a particular court. I mean, that's just about it.
Reportedly, yes. The only thing I want to say is we need to be cautious about our response to this. Um, Certainly, moral outrage at the killing of innocent people is warranted, of course, but also understand that, like you said, Diana, both of these things are true, right? Like that anti-Semitism is real and has been around for centuries. And the state of Israel, the political entity of Israel, is uh, prosecuting a genocide against the Palestinian people, children starving to death. How pro-life can you get, right? If you do not support food getting in to families and children, can you really be pro-life is one of the talking points here. So I just like, first of all, thank you journalists for all of this, right? Like all of this stuff we're reporting right now is coming from people who are dedicated to journalistic principles and sharing true factual information. With this shooting, continue to pay attention to trusted journalistic outlets, um, before we jump to any conclusions demonizing entire groups of people or anything like that. So that's all I have to say on that on record.
Okay, yeah, I think that's really important to underline, and to make sure that we get the facts in straight. But there is
You know, if you know, I'll just share a thought on that too. And I'm remembering back to October 7, and then the immediate aftermath, and the extended aftermath, and the suffering in Gaza. And you know, as a historian, not with special expertise in the Middle East, but as somebody who's taught world history, and in fact, I have taught units on Israel and Palestine in that capacity. Um, you know, my immediate thought was horror at the events on October 7, and fear.
yeah.
Fear because I knew the history. I knew how messy the history was. And I also knew that in trying to teach the history of this conflict that stretches back generations, right? Decades and decades, really more than a century, that it matters a lot kind of where you enter in to this history. There are some moments when you enter in and you're going to be side Israel. And there's other moments, if you start paying attention right here, you're going to be side, you know, Palestinians. And and it's an incredibly complex history, and a history that holds so much in the way of atrocities and hatred and cruelty and suffering. Um, and so what dawned on me at that moment, what I was really struck with in terms of how to respond to this, and how to respond to somebody who's not kind of personally invested, right? Somebody from kind of the outside, invested as I am as an American citizen who funds Israel, invested as you know, as an American Christian in all of these other ways, but not directly invested. And what I thought at that point is, there's very little, really nothing that I personally can do to make this better, to fix this conflict, to like bring resolution. That's not really within my power. But there are certainly things that I can do to make things worse,
Mm,
right? And that is, you know, things like oversimplifying, things like contributing to the demonization of any people group,
Right.
things that contribute to the callousness of people's hearts, right across the board. And I have watched with horror the actions of many American Christians who also are, you know, engaging from some distance, who I feel have done things to make things worse, to make all of us, to increase polarization, to increase dehumanization, to oversimplify, and to really rob us of our humanity as we and rob us of our ability to engage with the humanity of those who suffer, right? And so I haven't. This is the first time I've said this. This is unscripted, right? But just kind of sharing that I think a lot of our listeners probably feel overwhelmed with how do we respond to this situation, and it's appropriate to, I think, to be overwhelmed of all of the kind of units that I taught. And one of the themes of my world history course was the importance of history and understanding modern conflicts, right? But of all of the modern conflicts that I included, like this one really takes the cake in terms of the complexity and the long, long history. And so to have people jump in with zero knowledge of that history, and like I said, more often than not, end up making things worse, right? That disturbs me. And so I think, you know, in these moments too, in this tragedy, we see there it cannot be oversimplified. It cannot be, right? It doesn't fit these categories. You had this Jewish couple, by all accounts I read, lovely young people, right? As Jews working to alleviate the suffering in Gaza. Those are the stories that we need to hold up, and not use this to only further exacerbate the hatred and the animosity that drives further violence.
There is a really important aspect of this that ties into the Christian nationalism discussions, of course, that we're having with these other subjects too. And that is within the Christian nationalist community and many circles of evangelical and fundamentalist theology, there is a complete equation with modern political Israel with biblical Israel. And theologically, that just has to be wiped off of the map because that's a fallacy. That's just not true. We're talking about two entirely different things. I mean, it's a little like I was listening to a sermon by a rabbi earlier today, and she was saying that the one of the worst years of her life was when she got sent to Israel to study with Hebrew uh, rabbinical students because she was such a great student that her school thought that she would do really well if she went to Israel to study. Well, she gets to Israel to study, and all the classes are in Hebrew, and she doesn't understand a word of it because she was an excellent student in ancient Hebrew and ancient Israel history, but
Mm.
she knew nothing about contemporary Israel, and she couldn't speak the language. And so that's almost a perfect example of what happens with Christians when they try to talk about Israel now and Israel, the Bible, is that it's like not speaking the language. It's just two incredibly different entities. And so there's that theological piece that we can't repeat. I think we cannot repeat that enough. That's not it's not appropriate to conflate these two things. And the other just very brief thing in regard to that is that a lot of American Christians are unaware that there are varieties of Zionisms. And so when you even say, oh, it's just the Zionists, well, that doesn't make any sense either, because there are different kinds of Zionism. There are some that are much more like our Christian nationalism. And then there are some that are more like, if you would have called Reinhold Niebuhr a Christian nationalist, that they understand things like historical irony and that they see the fundamental ideals of Hebrew vision of life as being a good thing to have at the heart of a nation, but nevertheless, working it out is a very difficult kind of path. I mean, so it's almost like saying that any Christian who happens to be patriotic is a Christian nationalist. And that's not true in Israel, and it's not true of American Jews. And there's a wide diversity of political theologies that Jews around the world hold toward Israel itself and towards their own nations where they are citizens. And so that's one of the reasons why I was talking about the complexity that American Jews feel, is that they're trying to figure out, well, wait a second, how do I support Israel on one hand, because there are reasons why American Jews want to support Israel, and yet on the other hand recognize the moral calling of Jewish life that is at odds with the policy of this particular Israeli government. And so it's really, to me, the theological dimensions of this are really at play here, and they are very little discussed.
That is a preacher talking. I really appreciate the illustration with the languages. That is extremely helpful. And let me just clarify one thing that I was trying to say, just make it more concise. Don't let the Trump administration propagandize this tragedy.
Yeah.
That's what I want us to be cautious of and wary of. We know they're coming with an agenda. We know they're coming with a perspective. And my concern is that they would use this tragedy for unjust punishment, um, draconian crackdowns, and that we would buy into it because we have a justified moral outrage at these murders. So don't let them propagandize this tragedy.
Yeah.
One more topic, and then we'll try to tie it all together. There's this ongoing attack on Harvard University. So, a news article put it this way: the Trump administration has barred Harvard University from enrolling international students in a major escalation of its attack on one of America's most prestigious Ivy League schools. Um, Kristin, you're in higher ed. Like, what do you make of this? Why is this the particular attack? Why now? Why Harvard? Those kinds of things.
Well, one of the reasons is Harvard decided not to bend the knee and to stand up for its rights and to, press the issue, particularly with respect to international students. And I don't have all the details on this. One of you two may know a bit more. But I believe part of the backstory here is that Harvard refused to comply with respect to essentially reporting on its international students, right, making them vulnerable to attacks from the Trump administration. And just to, quick aside, I mean, as somebody in higher ed, this is what we do. Like we protect our students, like all of our students. This is our mission, and this is just who we are, and our entire vocations are focused around nurturing, mentoring, educating, and protecting our student body, whoever they are. And that includes international students, certainly not limited to international students, right? So, in other words, Harvard is doing exactly what we should expect universities to do for their students. If you're a parent getting ready to send a kid off to university, this is what you would want them to be doing for your student. And they are um, uh, pressing their rights, at least the rights that we once thought we had in this country. And the Trump administration, of course, is doing what they are doing across the board, across all sectors of society, which is these pressure tactics, right? And what we're discovering in these first months of the administration is, the avenues for their exercise of power, kind of beyond the obvious, beyond direct kind of state coercive control. There are all sorts of additional levers of power that they can use, carrots and sticks. And in this case, this is a stick, right? And stripping Harvard of the ability to enroll international students is a devastating blow. It really, if the same were done to Calvin, where I teach, it would also be an absolutely devastating blow to tuition dollars, but more importantly, to the educational mission and to the community itself.
And just to put this in perspective with numbers, international students, there's almost 7,000 of them at Harvard, representing
Oh,
27% of this year's intake. So it is a huge. And by the way, it should actually be a compliment to U.S. universities that people from other countries want to come to our universities to study. Any other political leader would recognize that value and want to actually promote and increase it and say our universities are the pride of the world, and that people from all over the globe recognize the academic and educational excellence of our universities. And it's really a great thing that international students want to come here. But here is this Trump regime weaponizing their power in order to impose their will. And this is a symbolic thing with real world ramifications, because if they can take down Harvard, that will signal that no other university or college can stand up to this regime. And so it's really important that Harvard actually made a statement
Yeah.
and resisted them, because if they had capitulated, what hope would any other university have that doesn't have a multi-billion-dollar endowment or the prestige or reputation that Harvard has? And so I'm glad they're fighting, but this regime is fighting dirty, and it's really tragic to see, because the people who feel the effects worst and most are the students.
so that
And what
was
we
the best slip of a tongue that I have ever heard having to do with higher education, since actually Harvard is the Howard of white universities.
And
She's
what we
got the
really need to
bangers
see here,
today.
Jamar, you're right that what happens, at Harvard matters, and it's it's hugely important that Harvard decided to take a stand when many other powerful institutions, including other universities, have, tried to get along. Go along, get along, and then, they come back asking for more. What's really necessary in this moment is signs of solidarity, right? All universities, all institutions of higher education, in this case, are in the same boat. And there are some kind of ethical, I think, and I would say civic obligations that university leaders need to confront, and stakeholders of showing up and presenting a united front rather than trying to keep your head down and hope that the administration doesn't come for you, right? So what we really need in this moment, and I think in many, is solidarity, and collective courage.
So we need to try to tie all of these things together
Do we know? Did
somehow, some kind of way. How can we
we?
make sense of this? The one thing I'll say is understand this regime is very interested in distraction.
Yeah.
All of these things are important, but there's other stuff going on, like the big, beautiful bill, which they held a House vote on at 1 a.m. Because listen, if it's so beautiful, why wouldn't you want it out in broad daylight? This tells us everything we need to know about what's really happening in this bill. I mean, obviously, read and learn more, but there are actual actions that this regime is taking that they're perfectly happy to have this flood of headlines distract us, not in the sense that these things aren't important, but also there's things that they continue to do and bulldoze their way through legislation or executive orders or dismantling of things that have long-term impact, long past a headline that might show up one day and is gone tomorrow. So it's really difficult, but we have to sort of think about the big picture here and all of the moving parts, not allow ourselves to get emotionally or psychologically overwhelmed by this flood of information, and continue just taking the right steps. Like I really appreciate what you said, Kristen. We can't always do something about what's happening, but we can at least not make it worse. So that's one thing. I do think that this regime would be interested in this flood of information as a way of distracting from some of the other things they're doing, and not to let ourselves fall into that.
Yeah, I was thinking about all these different stories and what was tying them together, and even many of the comments that you two made while we were recording, is that there's a very, if we want to try to simplify a whole bunch of global stories to some very simple level, to a very primary kind of level, is that most of these stories are about othering, and even stories we didn't mention. Um, I mean, there's a brand new pope, you know, and he's making a lot of really interesting moves right now, and that's a story in of itself. J.D. Vance was back making more theological news today because he had an interview with Ross Douthat in which he again completely mischaracterized both American history and Catholic theology, and yet he mischaracterized it in a way that othered. He kept talking about us and them.
Mm.
And every one of these stories is some political dimension of an us and them. And to me, in some very global sense, this is one of the driving narratives around the world today. Are we going to surrender to us and them politics and an us and them vision of humanity? Or are we going to try to really understand the connectedness of the human family and how deeply entwined the problems are that we face across the entire planet, and somehow forge uh, ties and programs and policies and politics that are beneficial both to the people who are closest to us and to those who are the furthest away, but recognizing all at once that we are part of the same family. And
Mm.
to me, there's a fundamental spiritual and theological vision that is at play at this moment. And it's coming up in all of these different stories. And I just think the more that people of faith can concentrate on resistance to the us versus them, resistance to the othering, and leaning towards our commonality. And it's not, we're not even, I'm not talking about a common culture or a common way of viewing things or common language, just the deep humanity and the integrity and dignity of every human being, and how that is we're all connected through being created in the image of God.
Mm.
Beautifully said, Diana.
Absolutely. Kristin, are you seeing any patterns in what we've discussed today?
Oh, I just want to say amen to what Diana was saying. One thing that each of us can do is to refuse to be changed,
Mm.
right? To refuse to uh, give up our core values, our ability to see other people's dignity across difference, to refuse to give in to the temptation to hate, quote unquote, our enemies instead of to love our enemies, to refuse to see people as enemies. And in so many cases, and in many of the cases we've discussed, right, we've already seen how these are artificial constructs. But the demonization of the other is the fuel that drives authoritarianism, and it is at the heart of Christian nationalism, this us versus them mentality. Christian nationalism doesn't work if you take that piece away, right? And so there's a kind of personal responsibility here, spiritual responsibility, an ethical responsibility in the onslaught of all of the news every single day, to stay grounded
Mm.
and to refuse to play that game. And I think the more of us who refuse to play that game, uh, the the more obstacles that we place in the path of those whose power um, depends on more and more and more of us playing that game. And if you just see these tactics, the stories, the responses, like you said, Jemar, let's wait for the response here. There are very powerful people in coalitions right now who are waiting and to use anything that they can. And if there isn't anything there, to make something up, to construct narratives, to incite people's fear of the other and hatred of the other. Just absolutely refuse to play that game.
It's a good word. Y'all, they can take a lot away from us, but they cannot take our values, our integrity, our character. So stay loving, stay committed, stay in community, and stay kind. That's going to do it. On behalf of me and my co host, thank you for joining us for the Convocation Unscripted. Of course, remember to subscribe at convocation.substack.com and to our individual Substacks. They'll be in the show notes. We'll see you soon on the next Convocation.